Good morning, members of the First Unitarian Congregation of Ottawa. My name is Robb Barnes, and I'm the Executive Director of Ecology Ottawa. It's really an honor and a privilege to share this time with you this morning. I really wish I could be there in person, but obviously things are still a little bit complicated, hopefully not for too much longer. Thank you for your commitment to community and to a greener and more just city and planet. Today I'd like to speak on the theme of resilience. As you know, we're now passing the 16th month since the calamitous global onset of COVID-19. This pandemic has killed over 4 million people worldwide, including nearly 600 here at home in Ottawa. Just last week, the Ecology Ottawa community lost a dear friend and former employee to this disease. So even as Ottawa's vaccination rates climb and we begin to see signs of a return to normal, we have been irrevocably changed. Beyond the human tragedy, the lives altered forever, and the devastating effects of long COVID, there are other important threads as we think back over the past 16 months. At a social and cultural level, we've seen heightened awareness of the causes and effects of racial injustice. And while the May 2020 killing of George Floyd lit a spark for structural and cultural change in the United States, it is a spark that has quickly spread across the globe. Here at home, in addition to a renewed discussion on themes of race, policing, and institutional reform, there has been renewed focus on the tragedy of Canada's residential schooling system. Of course, this discussion has been prompted by the recent discovery of hundreds of unmarked graves. Debates are raging over the meaning and identity of Canada, over who gets to write history, who gets remembered, over the meaning and implications of reconciliation in the 21st century. While the roots of all of these issues stretch back hundreds of years, it is no great logical leap to suspect that society's response to them has been intensified by this COVID experience, that the knock-on effects of a pandemic, spiraling unemployment, escalating inequalities, profound strains to community well-being, have exacerbated pre-existing fissures in our social fabric. COVID has magnified and compounded social ills and has brought them to the very forefront of the public imagination and discussion. Behind this narrative, I see two other very important stories as well. One is perhaps grim, but still important, while the other is far more hopeful. First, there's the story of what lurks behind this current crisis. For most of the past 16 months, COVID has displaced other threats in the public imagination. This is understandable. Just as a hungry person might focus on finding food rather than solving food insecurity, it makes sense that a pandemic-ravaged planet would focus on pressing issues of public health rather than on more distant-seeming ones. However, and I know this group needs no reminding here, the climate crisis hasn't gone anywhere. Despite a substantial dip in greenhouse gas emissions after the onset of the COVID pandemic, which, by the way, is one unprecedented in modern human history, atmospheric CO2 levels have now risen to 419 parts per million. This is a level not seen on Earth for at least the last 4 million years. We continue to see the real-life impacts of climate chaos and a rapidly heating world, from hundreds of people dying during the recent heat dome event in the West Coast, to devastating drought and wildfires threatening more lives in the American Southwest as we speak. 2020 was the hottest year on record, and 2021 threatens to shatter more records still. And as those of us familiar with climate change well know, our situation can't improve on a dime. The United Nations has warned that millions are now vulnerable to climate-induced hunger, drought, and disease. Many more lives are at risk, even if our society undergoes the radical transformation necessary to keep warming from spiraling out of control. To quote from an upcoming report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, which is the UN body that reviews and analyzes the state of play on climate change, they write, "Climate change will fundamentally reshape life on Earth in the coming decades, even if humans can tame planet-warming greenhouse gas emissions." They also write, "The worst is yet to come, affecting our children's and grandchildren's lives much more than our own." And so whatever we do next, we will need to do two things at once. As a community, as a country, and as a global family, we'll need to address near-term threats while committing unprecedented attention to what has been sometimes called the long emergency, the ongoing degradation of the very life support systems of our planet. The second story I want to tell is far more hopeful. In a fundamental way, the past year has shown the deep power of community resilience. We see this in at least two ways. First, the reaction to some of the most pernicious and destructive social ills of our time, racism, colonialism, poverty, has been a social awakening and a vibrant discussion that no one would have predicted only months earlier. It's been said, perhaps by some people who are more cynical than myself, that no one should ever let a good crisis go to waste. This crisis, its cascading effects and its sweeping counter-reaction, indicates to me that progress is truly possible in an open and democratic society. Debates matter, ideas matter, and they can ultimately strengthen our social fabric even in the face of profound adversity. People can be convinced, and entire institutions can change if we approach the problem with reason and perseverance, and we approach solutions with imagination and compassion. This has profound implications when it comes to the environment. At a fundamental level, the question we need to ask ourselves is, can we afford to go back to business as usual? Real and deep climate action has radical implications. We're not really asking everyone to just recycle or to shorten their showers or even to switch to an electric car, as helpful as these small steps might be. We're actually seeking a much more fundamental change, rooted in public policy and, at a deeper level, in a new ethics anchored around a more profound relationship with the natural world. We need a new energy system, we need a new food system, we need a new transportation system, and we need a new understanding of the role and function of key elements within our economy and social order. The past 16 months have demonstrated what is possible when society feels compelled to act around a pressing public health threat. When it comes to climate action, while governments have made some important policy moves and some declarative gestures over the past few years, there has never been a more pressing need for a radical reimagination of what should be normal or what should be considered possible. The second and perhaps more plain and obvious observation is this: we're still here. That is to say, the congregation, this conversation, etc., despite a once-in-a-century global pandemic with catastrophic shocks to some of the most fundamental threads that weave together our community fabric, there is so much that we haven't lost. Births, birthdays, graduations, gatherings with friends, congregation meetings like this one, supply lines, except for, of course, toilet paper, as we all know, all of these things withstood an unprecedented shock, sometimes in very surprising ways. I can't help but wonder about what this says about our capacity as a society. What are we truly capable of when we're pushed to the limit? From my position with Ecology Ottawa, I know that COVID did nothing to dampen the spirit of our community leaders. In May of last year, thousands raised their voices for an end to reckless urban sprawl. Thousands more took part in our tree program, working to improve their communities with the tangible act of planting trees. While chaos raged on the front page of every newspaper, we saw the same determined community work for things like better transit, better pedestrian networks, more bike lanes, cleaner air, and greater local climate ambition. And with so much potential for positive city-enhancing work in the darkest depths of a global crisis, what does this say about the capacity for transformative change in Ottawa in the months and years ahead? COVID has taught us not to take the power of community resilience for granted. We have been tested, and it turns out that we're much more powerful and much less fragile than we may have assumed. For that lesson, I'm deeply thankful and, despite everything, quite hopeful. Now I have a personal story to share. My son Will was born on March 16th, 2018. The COVID lockdown kicked in on his second birthday, and he's now spent more than a third of his life in a world dominated by a pandemic. Like millions of other kids across the planet, he's missed out on hugs from his grandparents, swimming lessons, gatherings with friends, and even the seemingly banal experience of going grocery shopping with his dad. His visits to the park got infinitely complicated, and until very recently, he got quite used to picking out a toddler-sized mask in the same way that he decides on his t-shirt or hat before we leave the house. I'm sure I was told this before I became a parent, but it didn't compute at the time. When people said fatherhood changes everything, I thought they were talking about losing sleep, or maybe never having enough time for anything. What I didn't anticipate was the immediate sense that it would be so easy to give up everything for someone who, at only 3 years of age, I've known for far less time than other family or close friends. I also didn't anticipate how my understanding of environmental action would change. Before Will arrived, I knew climate action had to be the fight of my lifetime, but only in an abstract way. Now, in the deepest way I can imagine, I'm tethered to a future that extends far beyond my time on this earth. With any luck, Will's future will go beyond the 2050 and 2100 guideposts we often use when talking about future climate impacts. However, even if we act with ambition and resolve, his future will unfold on a planet that is immeasurably more chaotic than the one any of us have known to date. It could well be a future of escalating systemic shocks, of severe weather, climate migration, food insecurity, and a geopolitical order that is completely rocked by routine bombardment from multiple crises. As you can imagine, this thought keeps me up at night. But beyond preparing Will in every way I know how, it also spurs me to continue working for a safe and healthy environment. Will's future will also be shaped by the lessons we've learned under COVID. The question is, what lessons will we draw? Here are a few that I would suggest. First, that scientific expertise, whether with climate models or vaccines, matters deeply and should be respected. Second, that when the planet focuses on a global risk affecting every one of us, heretofore unimaginable outcomes, like vaccines ready in under 1 year, are possible. Third, that proactive policymaking can save millions of lives, but only if we demand it, which gets to the fourth point. To do this well, we need to preserve the strength of our communities and the responsiveness of our democratic institutions. I hope we conclude that resilience is the key to our future in a climate-changed world. That like a forest that regrows after a devastating fire, or like the plants that punch through sidewalks and anything else that stands in their way, that we are capable of profound things. I'll close with a line from one of my personal heroes, Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King said, "If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward." That, to me, is the essence of resilience, that admixture of tenacity and hope. And whether we're talking about civil rights, recovery from a global pandemic, or resolve in the face of an escalating climate crisis, it points to the need for inner strength and intentional optimism. As we consider a return to a post-COVID world, I hope you'll join me in creating a new normal that works for everyone and that addresses the most pressing challenges of our day. I hope you'll recommit to grounding this global struggle in local action and community strength. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me this morning.